I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Today we're ranking the bosses of Elden Ring from worst to best in my opinion. This is part 1 of 2, tackling bosses 33 through 16, with next week's video tackling my top 15, so be sure to check that video out when it's up. Finally! We've made it to the last Soulsborne game on the list. The open world epic of Elden Ring. I only played this game once back at launch. I then made my boyfriend play through the game last summer, where he managed to beat Melania Blade of Mikola with a shield build. He's a god. For this playthrough, I decided to place some basic restrictions on myself for a fresher experience. Namely being no NPC summons during fights, no spirit summons, meaning Roderica got a lovely break in the round table, and I'd try not to use status ailments like bleed on any of the bosses for a more pure experience, with a single exception. For today's ranking, I'll be focusing on mandatory story bosses as well as those tied to achievements. This means a ton of the field bosses won't be getting featured, including the various dragon fights throughout the overworld, but maybe they'll be getting a feature on a future Soulsborne dragon boss ranking list, wink wink nudge nudge. Without further ado, all 33 main Elden Ring bosses ranked, and be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below. I can sum up Elden Ring's biggest flaws in a single boss fight, and you all know which one I'm talking about. The Godskin duo is a baffling late-game fight that feels completely out of place, and attempts to recapture the feeling of Ornstein and Smough, but botches the attempt completely. The first mandatory boss of Crumbling Farum Azula, and it's a gank fight repeat of two enemies that we've already fought multiple times solo, and whose movesets don't flow well together due to both of them being too aggressive. Coming from Dark Souls 3, where the Demon Princes showcase the power of having one active threat and one passive threat, in Elden Ring both the Godskins are considered active threats, making it very hard to balance the fight without needing to spirit summon or use the sleep pot strategy. In my first playthrough, I got the lads together, I summoned my best Spirit Ash, got the NPC summon signs near the door, made this fight as easy as I could, because going at it solo? No thanks. But in this footage playthrough, as you might be seeing, it was surprisingly easy, actually. With new knowledge of how to correctly distribute my stats for the build I wanted, I had more freedom to pump those levels into vigor and make myself a walking health tank with a twin blade. And having fought the Godskins at every opportunity prior, I knew what made them tick. However, just because I found it easy this time around, that doesn't forgive the fight of its sins. First-time players won't have the knowledge I do, and I still recall the community rankings back when Elden Ring first released, with this guy's being at the very bottom. Just the fact that the health bar isn't tied to the two enemies, but instead a collective pool of HP that means they can respawn after being defeated, is just baffling. No other boss in the game utilizes this mechanic, so why overcomplicate things for the player? That being said, while both of these bosses bottom the list, their solo entries will be more warmly regarded. Just avoiding the last place, we have Fia's Tier 3 Twitch subs. This NPC gauntlet comes rather out of nowhere, especially after you enter what is clearly an insanely large boss arena. Little did we know the true boss comes later. Just like the K-Lid Giant Pot, the champions are randomly generated from player builds found online, with the exception of Sorcerer Roger and Lionel the Lionhearted, and your goal is to defeat all 5 spirits to proceed. If I haven't made it clear across my boss ranking series throughout the Soulsborne games, I'm just not a fan of invader bosses. They either end up being far too easy, going down without much of a fight, or overly difficult because you're facing a player with overpowered gear. I played offline because I don't like paying subscriptions for online services, so I assume I got what could be considered the default champions. But I fully expect if you play online, you'll be seeing people wielding a ton of endgame equipment that could make Fia's champions surprisingly deadly. From my part, I actually struggled a lot in the third phase with the combination of the Jarman's dual-wielding axes and Lionel's death magic spam homing in on me throughout the fight. It was a real test of endurance, and I found I didn't have a moment to breathe, but not in the fun way. NPC invaders are just built differently to traditional bosses. The never-ending stamina, the fact they have the audacity to heal themselves, how dare they act like me, that's rude. I'd much rather fight a single NPC with a fully diverse moveset like Half-Light from Dark Souls 3 than a bunch of user-generated death machines. And lore-wise, I don't really see the point in Fia trying to murder me. I understand she's defending herself, but clearly she was more than capable when she murdered Dee in the Round Table Hold. She doesn't need her entourage to fight her battles for her. And it just feels so random in its placement. It's the one boss I guarantee I will forget about in a year's time. Sitting on a lonely peninsula behind Castle Morn lies the first Leonine Misbegotten of the game. You'll see these enemies throughout your time in Elden Ring, but I firmly believe this first encounter is the best. You're sufficiently low level for it to feel like a challenge, and the beast's moveset is aggressive enough that you have to play smart to survive, or you'll find your stamina depleted, posture broken, and body shattered. The arena is so cool, this grey, windswept beach hidden away, a large structure like a grave in the center, and a gnarled, withered tree jutting up into the sky. It reminds me of the Darklink Arena in Ocarina of Time's Water Temple. They always seem to show up with some of the best swords in the game, and the Japanese in-game file refers to these guys as Children of Radagon, which has some interesting lore implications for the race as a whole. The fight itself is about as hard as it is to manage the Leonine's aggression, though. I died once, but I wouldn't say it was because I struggled, more so that I just got a little bit cocky because I was handling the fight pretty well with my guard counters and Twin Blade build, and I just didn't pay attention to my health until it was suddenly gone. This is one of those early game fights that stands out in the moment, but once you move on to bigger and better things, it is quickly forgotten, which is a shame because Castle Morn itself is a great little mini-dungeon, and they picked a good boss to helm it, even if it ends up being outclassed by its Crusader variant later in the game. Worth it for the Game of Thrones sword, though. Okay, do not let it fool you that I beat the valiant gargoyles of the Shifra Aqueduct first try on this playthrough, because guess what? I purposefully left them until near the end so I could be over-leveled, because otherwise, their bullshit would be unbearable to fight. As is tradition, Miyazaki needed his dual gargoyle fix, and in Elden Ring, the valiant gargoyles fill that role. I'm more of a fan of the Black Blade Kindred enemies myself, but they're field bosses and won't appear on this list. So why do I hate the valiant gargoyles? Well, they have a similar issue as the Godskin duo, being that once the second one joins the fray, they're both fairly aggressive and fairly active, making it hard to focus one of the enemies down over the other. Openings are small, and it's hard to make your own when there's a twin blade in your face. Like the Demon Princes from Dark Souls 3, they attempt to shoehorn in a poison mechanic, but in Dark Souls 3 this worked because the poison was this dark purple that stood out amidst the arena. In Elden Ring, the poison is this very barely visible green that you won't see coming until suddenly your poison meter has bumped up halfway. Why they made such a vital element of the boss fight so impressively invisible, I will never understand. It's just not good game design. And combined with their aggressive nature, you have a fight that has claimed the lives of many a Soulsborne player. It'd be easier to just kill Morgott, go down and kill Suamog, and just use the secret path to Deeproot Depths through the Frenzied Flame Hall. Do yourselves a favor, don't bother doing this fight at the intended level, it truly isn't worth the hassle. Though I could honestly say that about most of the gank fights in Elden Ring if I'm being honest. If I could just take a few moments of your time, I'm trying to reach 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. I don't know if we can do it, but I'm hopeful. Look at how many viewers aren't subscribed, let's rectify that. Be sure to parry that subscribe button for new ranking videos every Wednesday. Back to the video. I suspect this will be my first hot take of the video, but for as exciting as I found the Dragonkin soldiers throughout the world on my first playthrough, this time around I don't have quite as much love for them and their slammy movesets. After all, fight the Dragonkin soldier in the Lake of Rot enough times and anybody would go crazy. What I can say is that the Noxtella variant at least has two aspects going for it: its arena and entrance, as you see the giant throne of Noxtella in the distance while the floor is filled with petrified corpses reaching up for something unseen, followed by the boss dropping in from the sky ready to absolutely slay the runway and ruin your day. The first phase is your classic big boss in Elden Ring. They'll use a series of large sweeps and slams that you have to roll or dodge through, and most of the time you'll be looking at the soldier's chest or legs, so you won't see what those arms are doing half the time. It's when the soldier powers up into its second phase that I find myself actually enjoying the fight, as the icy thunder it can summon creates a fun AoE-based moveset where you have to close the distance between yourself and the dragonkin. It's just a shame that the soldier will happily move throughout the arena, so you don't always have the largest windows to do damage. I died once to this boss during this playthrough because I got cocky and paid the price. I was riding the high of having a weapon that dealt good damage, and I'd been breezing through a lot of the early game. I didn't make that same mistake twice. I just think the Dragonkin soldier doesn't do a lot to differentiate itself from generic large-scale enemies, or even boss types that have similar movesets. I also just prefer smaller bosses in general, so this may just be a me thing, but seriously, don't bother with the Lake of Rot variant, whatever you do. Next up, to nobody's surprise, we have the resident brainiac of the Round Table Hold, the man that the FBI look to for inspiration when it comes to spying on the masses. Yes, it's Sir Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing! And depending on how you progress through Elden Ring and whether you spoke to him in the Round Table Hold, he will have a very different experience when it comes to this boss fight. Either you will walk in, hear his speech, backstab and murder him in a few hits, or like me, you've been talking to him the whole game, giving him information on the unlocated demigods like Moog, and suddenly he's launching blood at you, firing Rykard's skull flames, and using Renala's glintstone comets that absolutely destroyed my health bar, even with spell damage reductions. And those bloody golden rings, those golden rings. You know, perhaps it's a blessing I didn't beat Malenia before facing him, because I do not need him turning into a beautiful lotus flower on me. It's worth noting, as I found out post-game, that the spells he'd normally give you as rewards for info just get added to the Twin Maiden husks once he leaves the hold, assuming you do the requirements of beating Moog or Malenia first, which I didn't know about. If your vigor is low, you're gonna get one-shot by Gideon, and it's not even funny. Yet, if you don't interact with him at all, he has less spells to use against you, and you'll have an easier time. It's such a unique type of boss, and I'd love to see something similar, but on a boss fight with a physical moveset and not a magic moveset. But alas, we have to deal with Gideon's infinite mana fireworks show, which was the only fight where I broke out my Morgoth's cursed sword to do some blood flame bleed damage, because I was exhausted. I had just gotten my ass handed to me by Malenia for an entire afternoon. At least Gideon has the memes about himself to fall back on. Next up on our list, we have the Red Wolf of Radagon, fought at the midpoint of the Rhea Lucaria Academy, assumedly a gift left behind by Renala's ex-husband Papi Radagon. The wolf is versed in glintstone and Carian sorceries, and is a fun glass cannon to fight in the early game. The Red Wolf is nimble, able to hop and bounce around the arena while peppering you with magic-based sorceries, but makes up for this by having a fairly small health pool. This means that you can kill the wolf with relative ease if you're able to land some hits, but by that same merit, the magic it casts will do the same type of damage to you, the player, meaning one way or another, the fight will be over quickly, as I learned multiple times. With my Twin Blade build, I had no choice but to get in close to the Red Wolf, otherwise I wouldn't be able to get off any of my combos, which led to quite a few deaths. Having to roll out of the way of magic attacks, only to have my posture broken by blocking the bite attacks that followed, left me in tatters. But I actually like the way this fight is decided in those opening moments, set to an intense score as you dodge your way through his glint blades, hoping he doesn't spam the same move multiple times. Though for as fun as this boss fight was in the moment, re-encountering this boss in the wild, both in the Eternal City of Nokron, as well as behind Caria Manor, really soured my feelings on the Red Wolf. The reason the boss fight variant works well is because it's an enclosed space, so you and your opponent are never too far away from each other. In the wild, with so much empty space, it's way harder to actually land hits, and that's on top of all the baby wolves around it. Obviously, this is a ranking of the main boss fight itself, but I wanted to bring up those little rematches while I had the opportunity. It just ranks down low on my list for being a little unremarkable in the grand scheme of things. I don't see people clamoring for more Red Wolf rematches over a majority of the grander bosses in the game, and that's fine. Nobody said a low ranking means low quality. Speaking of a low ranking not being indicative of quality, the Ancestor Spirits are next up on this list. Now, I'm lumping both variations together with a focus on the Regal Ancestor Spirit, as it's the upgraded version of the fight. And lore-wise, these guys are great. These spirits are deities worshipped by the ancestral followers of Shifra River, and you can only fight them after lighting all the sconces found throughout. From moment zero, you're struck with the melancholic spiritual theme that plays as you fight. It's not boss music, but more of a character track that highlights the ancient nature of these ancestor spirits. They fight you with subdued, graceful attacks, their cries riding along the wind. You get the sense that these are creatures that have existed long before anything else in the lands between, even the Erd Tree, and I imagine in their prime, these spirits were deified similar to Marika or Placidusax. What's interesting is that both boss fights are fragile health-wise, but the Regal variant can utilize the spirit animals in the boss arena to heal itself up. And if you're not doing enough damage like my boyfriend in his playthrough, you can get trapped in a cycle of damage and restoration that can be a little tedious. I remember seeing the Ancestor Spirits in the trailer for Elden Ring and thinking, dang, that looks cool, and even now I still hold that sentiment. But I have to admit that as far as being an actual fight, it is a little lacking in that killer instinct that most bosses have. That also happens to be the Ancestor Spirit's charm though, and I suspect this boss battle is a favourite in the community, not for the fight itself, but for everything surrounding it. The lore, the ambiance, the atmosphere, the music, the grace. For what could be seen as a fairly missable open world boss is extremely impactful, and I'd love to know more about their lore someday. As you progress from the early game to the mid-game of Elden Ring, you will start coming across magma worms. If you took the Grand Lift of Dectus to the Altus Plateau, your first encounter with these creatures will likely be the Mount Gelmir variant near a giant lava pool, and if that is the case, I'm so sorry. But this entry focuses on the Magma Worm Makar, tied to an achievement as a way of rewarding you for finding an alternate path to Altus Plateau. And I'd say this is the best Magma Worm fight in the game. At the very least, it is the best arena, this ancient ruin just under the ground, sunlight peeking through the cracks in the ceiling as water trickles down into pools along the ground. And from the far side of the room, a gigantic scaled worm begins lumbering towards you. The magma worms have two states, their quadrupedal form, where they'll crawl along the ground attempting to smash you with the arms and magma breath, and then after you reach a certain HP threshold, they stand on their hind legs, alight their curved sword with flame, and begin attempting to slice and strike you down. These creatures are fascinating lore-wise, as they're the result of what happens to people who overindulged in Dragon Communion, the consumption of dragon hearts to gain new abilities. I imagine tarnished players who are using draconic abilities are probably thinking, oh shit. The second phase of the fight, where it's on its hind legs, is much better than the first. Dodging sword swings feels far more intuitive than dodging arm slams, as an example. Similar issue to what I had with the Dragonkin of Noxtella, but I just prefer the Magma Worm's design more. Plus, Makar seems well designed for the arena you fight him in, which I can't really say for the Mount Gelmir worm, who constantly decides that charging back into the giant lava pool is the way to go. There's also the great worm Theodorix in the Consecrated Snowfield, but his arena's a bit bland, being this large ice cavern that's just on a flat surface. Give me cool ruins like Makar's arena any day. I almost wish Makar was the only magma worm, because then I'd have a more positive opinion on the fight. But Elden Ring has a bad habit of overusing some of their best fights and making them feel less impactful as a result. Case in point, our next entry. Deep within the Volcano Manor lies the Temple of Aegli, the ancient serpent, and seemingly guarding it, is the Godskin Noble. The larger of the two Godskin bosses, and by far my least favourite of the two, this chonky man turns his rapier to you as you approach. I won't pretend to understand why he's here, but I recognise that the Godskin Apostles and Nobles have striking similarities to the snakes found throughout the Volcano Manor, even if their lore is more tied towards Malekith and the Rune of Destined Death than Rykard and the Recusants. Whatever the case, it doesn't matter because we get to listen to the Godskin OST, which for me, I'll just say now, is the best theme from Elden Ring, even beating out the main one. There's something so self-righteous and triumphant, yet absolutely horrifying under the surface. From Software know how to make the best blasphemous religious choir tracks after all. So why do I dislike the Noble compared to his counterpart? Well, let me start with what I do like. I enjoy the fast-paced stabs of his rapier, how despite his weight, he has a speed you wouldn't expect. Subversion is such a powerful tool. Then the second phase hits, and his fight goes from intense to downright goofy. The inflation fetish comes out in full force, and the Noble begins expanding. From a devastating ground pound slam to the infamous Noble rolling spin dash attack that I find incredibly difficult to avoid. This guy has personality to spare, but said rolling attack can last an incredibly long time to the point of just being annoying. And he also has a belly thrust attack that, according to the wiki, comes out in less than 13 frames, making it nearly impossible to dodge for a regular player. I'm not a fan of enemies that can do long combo strings only to bounce into an instant attack hit like that. Now, when Elden Ring first came out, we were all screaming about boss difficulty, and in this recent playthrough, I'll admit that I had a much easier time with the majority of the game's bosses, but the Noble still just is a tad too aggressive for where he is, and his moveset being that aggressive directly affects why the Godskin duo fight later in the game sucks so much. I'm just letting out my feelings here. At least the Apostle is so much better, we'll be seeing him next week. If we're talking difficulty, the Mimic tier is one of the easiest bosses in the game, easily cheesable with some equipment shenanigans, and for many players, it'll just be a footnote in their story. But when I first found this boss, I was floored. This was the equivalent of finding Dark Link in the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time, and it's crazy I've mentioned that twice in this video. This was the equivalent of escaping Badalin in Celeste. Fighting against yourself, but a version of yourself with infinite mana, can be quite enjoyable. For this playthrough, I purposefully picked one of my weaker weapons so I could just enjoy the fight a little bit more, because I knew I'd be able to win against the Mimic tier, so why rush it? Why not equip some fun gear and have a bit of fun? So often, boss quality is equated with boss difficulty, because that's what a majority of Soulsborne players have been indoctrinated to feel. But eventually you're going to realize that difficulty isn't everything. Unique experiences should trump having a boss with a few delayed moves, you know? And I appreciate that with the Mimic tier, they really tried something different to give the player a fun encounter they won't soon forget. I'm sorry, but if you choose to cheese this boss, that's not a flaw of the boss's design. That's you deciding to exploit a mechanic for personal gain, and I can't say that's truly engaging with the spirit of what the Mimic tier fight is all about. If the Mimic tier had a bit more health and a little more poise, I could see it being a genuine threat to the player. Would love to see that. I'm going to upset a lot of people when I rank the actual Godfrey fight, because spoilers, I'm not as high on it as most people. But for now, let's talk about the Golden Shade Godfrey in the Erd Tree Sanctuary. Atop Lane Dell, after climbing the roots of the Erd Tree, you encounter the last of Morgoth's apparitions, a spirit of his father Godfrey in his prime. This effectively is a teaching method for a much harder fight later in the game, similar to Sewer Moog being a lesson for Moog's Phase 1. Godfrey is a lesson for the future Godfrey fight, and his moveset is fun to learn. He doesn't have a terrible amount of HP, so you're not going to be stuck here for very long, but you can get just enough of an idea for what you're in for later before you slay the man. If anything, the lore of this fight and the surprise of the encounter are what have it ranked so highly. Because I wasn't expecting to see Godfrey this early in the game, nor did I realize that he was a summon of Morgoth's, because who else could Morgoth call upon but the spirit of his father? He has a very tragic backstory we will get into eventually, but it really contextualizes why Godfrey is here to stop you. I'd honestly rather save the rest of my thoughts for when I reach Godfrey's actual fight in part 2 of this series, so be sure to stay tuned for my full thoughts then. I'll end this segment by saying, this is a fun fight, feels great to dodge attacks, I like that you can guard counter without much risk, and the attacks are well telegraphed. Good stuff. Guarding the entrance to Lanedale, if you want to earn the right to enter the capital, you have to face down against the draconic Tree Sentinel. This mounted evolution of the Tree Sentinel field boss is a massive step up in both quality and difficulty, taking what was already a difficult boss for many on their first playthrough, and giving it a much larger kit. Wielding the giant Dragon Greatclaw and Dragon Claw shield, it's an intimidating sight. The only way to defend from the ancient dragons was to become them, so to speak, and with it comes a host of new attacks. The horses being able to shoot fireballs at you is certainly the most infamous, as they're hard-coded to use that move when you attempt to heal, but for the rest of the first phase, it's the same fare you faced with the basic Tree Sentinels, but with a few more AoEs chucked in. It's not until the second phase, when their weapons become imbued with the red lightning of the ancient dragons, that things get real. With the power of the Dragon's Lightning, all of the Tree Sentinel's attacks are now charged with that same power, meaning more dangerous AoEs with every slam, and a host of new ranged attacks that can leave you devastated. There's the patches of lightning that appear throughout the arena, and standing in them will get you struck by thunder. My favorite move though is when he raises his shield and calls down a targeted lightning bolt on your location. He isn't the first FromSoft boss to use this mechanic, as I believe Nameless King did it first, but timing those dodges perfectly just feels so satisfying. The most dangerous move is his lightning sweep attack that he combos into a large axe slam. If you're not in close range, the cone of lightning spread across the floor will likely catch you and end your run there and then. But if you survive this attack, it powers the Sentinel down for a small period, allowing you to get some hits in without the lightning AoE. I just find the Tree Sentinel to be a great test of a player's skill going into the mid to late game of Elden Ring, while the Draconic Tree Sentinel at the end of Farum Azula acts as your final exam, as there you can't summon Torrent for easier escape. One of the best mandatory field bosses in the game. Starting off this video's top 5, we have Commander Nile, found at Castle Sol. One of two Commander-type bosses, the other being the rot-loving O'Neill in the Swamp of Aeonia, I find Nile to be the stronger fight of the two for multiple reasons. Mainly being that he doesn't spam me with waves upon waves of small spirit enemies to decimate my health bar, and he doesn't inflict rot like O'Neill. Instant bonus points there. Commander Nile starts off the fight as a support unit, buffing his 2 spirit summons and playing a mostly passive role as you fight them. This is partly why I have this fight ranked lower on my list, because I find the Banished Knights to be overkill when I think Nile can easily stand alone with his prosthesis and Commander's standard moveset. You can backstab one of the spirits as they spawn for easy damage, or if you're feeling really fruity, use a Bewitching Branch on one of them to make them fight each other. Either way, Nile will enter his aggressive state either after both spirits are dead, or he reaches a certain threshold of health, and that's when the fight truly begins. Nile's main danger are his frosty AoEs that he can whip up by swinging around his flag, combined with his surprisingly fast movement as he whirls through the arena towards you, and you've got to be on your guard. I especially love when he launches into the air and charges his prosthesis with thunder to strike you down. I love a man who can utilize his weakness as a strength. This is also one of the few fights I didn't throw myself at the wall with. His health is extremely high, but by this point, you should have access to enough upgrade materials to get a plus 23 weapon for standard smithing stones, and a plus 9 weapon for special gear. And upon upgrading, I did just enough damage to tip the scales in my favor without being too overpowered. Nile is perfectly placed in the game to provide a challenge regardless of level, and once you understand how his AoEs work and know what to look out for, including those sneaky stomps of his, you'll make quick work of the Commander. It's his lore that holds him back slightly, but more so because he's so mysterious, as is Castle Sol itself. With ties to Miquella, Melania, and Godwyn, and a rumored eclipse, you just know that the lore on offer is going to be tied to the upcoming DLC somehow. Straight up, we all need to make a public apology to the Fire Giant for fundamentally misunderstanding his fight back when the game first launched. because I recall absolutely despising this fight when I first played. A giant shield that could one-hit kill Torrent as I approached, so many dangerous fire attacks that one-shot me in phase 2, having to hack away at those back legs the entire fight. But in reality, it's only the first phase that has you hacking away at those ankles, and only at the one with the shatterable equipment. This playthrough, I learned that taking Torrent into this battle beyond getting up to where the giant was, isn't actually a good idea. But leaping off Torrent to avoid a giant shockwave only to land and rush my way up to the giant felt so damn badass and was way more satisfying to pull off. With decent dodge timing, you can avoid all of the sweeps the giant does with his shield, and his flame attacks are limited in phase 1, especially if you stay close to him. You'll more often be attacked by his ranged fireball proximity mines, get too close and they prime to explode, but they're easy enough to trigger and avoid. At range, he can also launch a pyromancy at you, but since you'll be near his ankle for most of the first phase, that's not a problem. It's phase 2 when he rips his leg off and the face on his chest opens up to reveal the flaming eye of the Fell God that things get real. And also misunderstood. You see, all the big gaming publications who made walkthroughs for Elden Ring assumed that the best way to fight the fire giant was to keep doing what you were doing, hit his legs, whittle his health down. But as it turns out, the best way to fight this phase is to remain in front of the fire giant and attack his hands. They're targetable for a reason, and most of his pyromancies can be dodged through or skirted around when you can see them coming. Fighting at his front also stops you from getting rolled on when the fire giant decides to move positions. The only issue of this phase that I do have is that the weak spots, the hands, aren't vulnerable often enough. The fire giant can very quickly launch into his next set of attacks, meaning you won't have a lot of time to get hits in. I also think there was a missed opportunity in making the eye on his chest a weak spot. It takes the same amount of damage as the rest of the body, when I feel if you're able to strike it, you should get some good damage payoff. Ultimately, I still think the fire giant is a bit of a slow burn as a fight, and it's not quite my cup of tea overall, but I understand the developer vision now, and I'm glad I got to experience this fight as it was intended for after all this time. Alright, we've made it to the really good fights now. I've only got positives to say from this point on, so let's start with Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree. For this entry, I'm considering both her Courier Mana and her Haligtree battle as part of this single entry. It's the same boss, just with a more enhanced moveset at Haligtree, and that's okay. A mounted mage unit wasn't something I expected to find in Elden Ring, but as a fan of fighting horse-mounted enemies while on the ground, I found dodging through Loretta's Carian spells to be quite satisfying in her first battle. But at Courier Mana, aside from the Glintblade Phalanx, she tends to stick to various physical attacks to get her damage in. It's the second appearance at the Haligtree where she truly comes into her own, wielding upgraded versions of her prior spells. As someone who ran an intelligence build my first time through, I relied quite heavily on Loretta's Greatbow, and I found a kinship with the boss when I fought her at the Haligtree, and she pulled out her much stronger Greatbow variant that can fire 4 arrows at once. There's also her slash combo where she alights her sickle with magic and attempts to swing at you before launching into the air to do a large slam beneath her. Epic to dodge, on top of the usual attacks from her and her horse. I love a good magic fight that can balance the magic and the melee to create a dance between the player and foe, and Loretta absolutely nails this vibe to me. I also love that her lore implies she's actually an Albinauric, the race of people in the lands between who are persecuted by those above, and whose legs are weak and frail. It would contextualize why Loretta both wields magic and rides a horse, as she'd potentially need magical aid to ride her mount effectively, and it keeps her from needing to fight on her own where she may potentially struggle to even stand. If only Loretta had more fanfare at the Haligtree instead of just getting the generic Tree Sentinel music, she could have been perfection. I went back and forth on the next 4 placements in my ranking, but only 2 bosses remain in today's video. So who ultimately missed out on my top 15? Well, let's start with the secret optional boss at the end of Fear's questline, Lich Dragon Fortisax. This is the boss variant of the ancient dragons you can find in Farum Azula, as well as the Lanciax field boss in the Altus Plateau, and features a slightly more enhanced moveset compared to its patriots. Once a friend of Godwyn, Fortisax fought back against the Death Blight slowly afflicting Godwyn, and ultimately became corrupted by it, needing to be slain to complete Fear's last request and obtain the Mending Rune of the Death Prince. As for the fight itself, the game really goes out of its way to up the intimidation factor of the beast, from the haunting arena with that absolutely insane looking skybox, to the dramatic epic score composed by Yoshimi Kudo, to the intimidation that comes from this dark blighted dragon crackling with red energy. Now, like most dragons in this game, he has their basic moveset of slams, swipes, flame breaths, tail spins, etc. I don't feel like I need to go over those, so let's focus on his unique abilities. He can use his signature lightning spear attacks to create two absolutely massive explosions that can either be ran from or rolled through. He can launch up into the air and summon a lightning glaive that he brings down upon the player in a spinning motion. He can charge the player with lightning that will, after a certain point, transfer to the ground and subsequently be struck by thunder. But perhaps his most infamous move, and the one that actually keeps him out of the top 15, is his Death Lightning. I just heavily dislike the Deathblight mechanic in Elden Ring, and having a move that summons patches of Deathblight fog throughout the arena, even if telegraphed, just doesn't appeal to me. I'd rather not be worrying about a ticking time bomb of a Deathblight meter when I'm fighting an insanely strong dragon and trying to enjoy that aspect of the fight. At the same time though, if he didn't use any Deathblight, I'd be confused as to why the fight doesn't incorporate the signature motif of this questline, so I think it's a lose-lose situation. Still, an epic dragon fight that showcases both spectacle and substance to create a memorable moment for the player. And just missing out on the top 15 position, the final boss in today's video, we have Astel, Natural Born of the Void. Fought at the end of Rani's questline after journeying through the Eternal City of Noxtella and the Lake of Rot, this creature from beyond the stars is the first real indication of the cosmic nature of the forces dictating the lands between. While I'm not certain of Astel's full lore, I've seen interpretations that the Falling Star Beasts were sent to wipe out the Eternal Cities for attempting to commit blasphemous acts, and this specific Astel used its gravity sorcery to take away Noxtella's sky, sealing them underground. As for our fight with the beast, Astel isn't a terribly difficult boss once you know the moveset, but has a lot of jerky movements that I found a little annoying to deal with, and I found I would rather just tank damage than dodge. There's the space laser it shoots you with as you enter, which you can dodge with good timing I did not have when I entered at first, often followed up by his tail slams that, in my opinion, have a slightly off hitbox. Once you're up close and personal, Astel can utilize cosmic forces to create lines of exploding nebulas, or will just try and strike you through with its mandibles. I found it easier to just tank those hits and heal through them, though you have to be careful of its crushing bite grab that can be rolled away from if you're in close. I never got caught by it, but I know that it's devastating. Astel's real power though comes from his gravity magic, able to create shockwaves of darkness that you can either attempt to roll through or run from. He can reverse gravity to lift you into the air before slamming you back down for massive damage. His teleport can be tricky to handle, especially if he teleports up to use his grab attack with its stupidly strong hitbox. But perhaps most of all, it's his meteorite attack he uses halfway through the fight that is the most dangerous to the casual player. The meteors fire indiscriminately and do a hefty amount of damage if you haven't leveled your vigor. But Astel's lower HP pool and fairly weak head make it easy to outdamage him if you've got a good enough weapon. It's a shame then for such a unique boss to end Rani's questline that they reuse it in the consecrated snowfield with Astel Stars of Darkness. This rematch just feels a bit tasteless, as why would there be an Astel hidden in the consecrated snowfield? And why does this Astel have an insanely cool yet scary clone jutsu grab attack that can only be dodged by moving to the center of the arena? Questions that need answers, Miyazaki. I used to be much higher on Astel, but on my recent playthrough I found he didn't hold the same immediate charm I thought he had, but that design, that arena, and that music hold this fight up against its compatriots for a number 16 spot. And that's the end of part 1 of my Elden Ring boss rankings. Of all the Soulsborne games, Elden Ring has easily been the hardest to pin down a ranking for. There's just so much that goes into how you experience a boss in this game, so I hope you can all forgive that my opinions will likely differ from your own. If you enjoyed this video, consider parrying that subscribe button for more weekly content every Wednesday. My socials are on screen now, feel free to follow where you feel comfortable. I recommend my Twitter. A massive shout out to my patrons over on Patreon who have supported me for yet another month. You guys are awesome. And I will see you guys next week for part 2 of my Elden Ring boss rankings. Adios.